AI analyzed every moon landing photo ever taken. It found something embedded in all of them. The thing hiding in plain sight. Between July 1969 and December 1972, 12 men walked on the surface of the moon. They took thousands of photographs while they were there. Those photos are some of the most looked at images in human history. They have been printed in school books, shown on television, and studied by scientists for more than 50 years. Almost every person alive today has seen at least one of them. And yet, for decades, almost nobody noticed the small shapes scattered across every single frame. If you look at any photo taken on the surface of the moon by an Apollo astronaut, you will see them. Tiny black plus signs. Little crosses. They sit on top of the lunar dust, on top of the spacesuits, on top of the flag. They show up in every picture, from the first mission to the last, always in the same spots. When you first notice them, they look strange. Conspiracy theorists have pointed at them for years as proof the whole thing was faked. But the truth is stranger and smarter than any hoax story. Each tiny cross was a scientific tool doing a specific job. What that job was is where the story gets good at. The cameras that went to the moon. Before we can talk about what those crosses are doing, we need to talk about the cameras that made them. The cameras used on the moon were not normal store-bought cameras. They were special machines built by a Swedish company called Hasselblad, working side by side with NASA engineers for nearly a decade before Apollo 11 ever launched. The story starts in 1962. An American astronaut named Walter Schirra walked into a camera shop in Houston, Texas, looking for something to take into space. He came out with a Hasselblad 500C. He liked it because it was simple, strong, and could take very sharp pictures. NASA bought a few, stripped them down to save weight, and started using them on the Mercury program. By the time Apollo 11 was ready to launch, Hasselblad had designed a new version called the electric data camera. It was painted silver on the outside to protect it from heat. The shutter buttons were made bigger so astronauts could press them while wearing thick spacesuit gloves. The lenses were built by a German company called Zeiss. The film inside was a special thin type made by Kodak that could hold 200 pictures on a single roll instead of the usual 70. But there was one more change, and this is the important one. Before the film was loaded into the camera, it was pressed flat against a piece of glass. Not plain glass. This piece of glass had a pattern carved into it, a pattern of tiny crosses arranged in a perfect grid. Whenever the astronaut pressed the shutter, light passed through that glass before hitting the film. The crosses on the glass blocked the light in those exact spots. And when the film was developed back on Earth, the shadow of every single cross appeared on every single picture. The glass was called a Rideau plate. The crosses were called fiducials. And the moment you understand why they were there, the whole purpose of the Apollo cameras opens up. What those crosses were doing had a name, and that name is the next piece of the puzzle. The word for what they were doing is photogrammetry. It sounds complicated, but the idea behind it is simple. Photogrammetry is the science of measuring real objects by studying photographs of them. If you have a picture of something and you know a few specific details about how the picture was taken, you can figure out the actual size of the things in the picture, how far apart they were, and how far away they were from the camera. This was a big deal for the moon missions. The astronauts were not just there to plant flags and bring back rocks. They were there to do real science. NASA wanted to know the exact size of every boulder they saw, the exact distance between craters, the exact height of the mountains in the background, the exact depth of the footprints in the dust. To get any of this information from a photograph, they needed a reliable way to measure things inside the picture. That is where the crosses come in. Each cross on the Rideau plate was carved into the glass with incredible care. The entire grid held 25 crosses arranged in a 5x5 pattern. The space between each cross was exactly 10 millimeters. That spacing was so precise that the error between one cross and the next was no more than 0.02 of a millimeter. That is smaller than a human hair. Each cross had 4 little arms sticking out, each one a single millimeter long. The engineers designed this for precision. Because the crosses showed up on every photograph, they acted like a built-in ruler. Scientists on Earth could look at any picture and use the spacing between the crosses to work out the scale. They knew how big the crosses were. They knew how far apart they were. They knew the exact lens on the camera. So if an astronaut took a photo of a rock, a scientist could measure the rock in the picture by comparing it to the cross marks around it. There was a second job the crosses did too, and it was just as important as the first. Without it, the whole measurement system would have fallen apart over time. That second job is what comes next. The check for distortion. Film is a strange material. It is made of thin plastic coated with chemicals that react to light. When you store film for a long time, especially in extreme heat or extreme cold, it can stretch, it can shrink, it can warp slightly in ways you cannot see with your eyes. The moon is not a gentle place for film. In direct sunlight, the lunar surface can reach temperatures of more than 120 degrees Celsius. In shadow, it drops to -65 degrees Celsius. A piece of film exposed to that kind of swing could easily be a little off by the time it got back to Earth. This is a big problem if you are trying to measure things from the photo. If the film has stretched by even a fraction of a percent, your measurements will be wrong. A boulder you calculated as 2 meters wide might really be 1.95 meters wide, or 2.08. For rough work, that is fine. For real science, that is a disaster. Crosses solved this problem perfectly. Because the crosses were carved into glass, not film, they never changed. The glass stayed exactly the same. So when the film was developed, the scientists could compare where the crosses actually appeared on the photo to where they were supposed to be based on the original glass pattern. If the crosses on the photo were all in the right places, great. The film was undamaged and the picture could be trusted. If the crosses were slightly off, the scientists could see by exactly how much. Then they could adjust the whole image to put everything back where it belonged. This is the kind of thinking that went into every part of the Apollo missions. Nothing was left to guesswork. The crosses were not decoration. They were a quality check, built right into the camera, that told scientists whether the photo they were holding was still a faithful record of what the astronaut had seen. They were there so that when a measurement was made 50 years later, it would still be accurate. The crosses worked, but they also created a strange side effect that conspiracy theorists have been pointing at for decades. That side effect, and what actually causes it, is where the story takes an odd turn. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Why some crosses seem to disappear. If you go online and search for photos of the moon landings, you will eventually run into videos and websites claiming that the Apollo photos are fake. One of the most common pieces of evidence people point to is the crosses. They say, look closely. In some photos, parts of the crosses appear to be hidden behind objects in the scene. A flagpole covers part of a cross. A spacesuit blocks out the top of one. A piece of equipment sits in front of another. The claim is that this is impossible. The crosses are supposed to be on top of everything because they were added last, pressed against the film. So if an object is in front of a cross, that object must have been added to the photo after the fact in a studio. The actual explanation is much simpler, and anyone with a basic understanding of film photography will recognize it instantly. They were shadows caused by tiny carved lines on a piece of glass. The lines themselves were extremely thin, just 0.02 of a millimeter wide. That is the width of maybe 3 or 4 human hairs pressed together. When a cross falls in front of a dark object, the shadow is easy to see because there is a clear difference between the dark object and the even darker cross. But when a cross falls in front of something very bright, something lit up brilliantly by the sun, the contrast falls apart. The bright light floods around the thin crossmark on the film. The cross gets washed out. Parts of it vanish into the glare. This is the same thing that happens if you try to photograph a thin black thread stretched across a lamp turned on at full brightness. In front of a dark wall, the thread shows up clearly. In front of the bulb, it disappears. The thread is still there. The camera just cannot separate it from the brightness behind it. High-quality scans of the original Apollo film show this effect clearly. When you look at a good scan, the missing crosses are not actually missing. They are still there, just very faint. The old prints that conspiracy videos use are low-quality copies where the faint parts have been lost through endless duplication. The crosses never broke the rules of physics. The rules of physics just made them hard to see in certain spots. The next piece of the puzzle is even bigger because it involves numbers that most people never stop to think about. The scale of what exists. People tend to think of the moon landing photos as a small set of famous shots. The boot print, the flag, Buzz Aldrin standing in front of the lander, the footprints trailing across the dust. In reality, the archive is much, much bigger than that. The 6 successful Apollo landing missions took an enormous number of photographs, both on the surface and from orbit around the moon. The NASA archives hold around 35,000 photographs from the Apollo program, taken across the full span of missions. In 2015, a man named Kip Teague began uploading high-resolution scans of these photos to a public website called the Project Apollo Archive. The upload ran to more than 8,400 super high-resolution images, pulled from scans of the original film made at Johnson Space Center. Anyone could look at them. Anyone could zoom in. And for the first time, people could examine every corner of every frame at a level of detail that had never been publicly available before. Then in 2022, a photo expert named Andy Saunders published a book called Apollo Remastered. He went through all 35,000 images in the NASA archive frame by frame and digitally restored them pixel by pixel. Things that had been lost in old, faded copies came back into view. Details nobody had ever seen clearly were suddenly obvious. The crosses, of course, were in every single one. Every photo taken on the lunar surface with a Hasselblad data camera had the Riso plate shadow pattern in it. Every one. The command module camera, which stayed in orbit and never landed, did not have the plate installed. So photos taken from orbit through that camera do not have the crosses. But every single photo from the surface does. Dozens of crosses per frame, thousands of frames across 6 missions, equals hundreds of thousands of tiny crosses floating across the photographic record of the moon landings. When you start actually counting, the number is staggering. And it keeps building, because the cameras that took those pictures are still up there. The final strange fact about this whole story is what came next and what did not. The cameras that never came home. Here is something most people do not know. When the Apollo astronauts finished their work on the moon, they did not bring their cameras back with them. 12 Hasselblad cameras sit on the moon right now, in 6 different spots, still there from the missions that left them. The reason is simple: weight. To lift off the lunar surface and meet back up with the command module in orbit, the lunar lander could only carry so much. Moon rocks were more valuable to science than used cameras. So the astronauts pulled out the film magazines, tucked them safely away, and jettisoned the camera bodies and lenses onto the dust. Across the 6 successful landing missions, the astronauts brought home around 382 kilograms of lunar rock and soil. In exchange, they left 12 cameras on the surface. Those cameras have been sitting in vacuum at extreme temperatures for more than 50 years. Nobody has touched them. Nobody has photographed them up close since they were dropped. They are artifacts of a moment that the human species has not repeated since 1972. What this means for the photos is that the Riso plates, The thin sheets of engraved glass that put the crosses on every image are still sitting up there too, inside the camera bodies. The only reason we have the pictures is that the astronauts carefully removed the film magazines before ditching the cameras. The film came back. The glass stayed. The crosses on Earth are shadows of patterns that still exist, hundreds of thousands of kilometers away, untouched since the Nixon administration. And this is why those tiny crosses matter more than they seem to. They are not just marks on a photo. They are the proof that behind every Apollo picture there was a system designed by engineers who cared about accuracy more than pretty pictures. Every time you see one of those crosses, you are seeing the decision of someone in the 1960s who looked at a photograph and said, "This needs to be something we can measure." They built a tool that could survive the journey. They pressed it against the film. They made sure the shadow would appear every time. And they were right. 54 years later, scientists are still using those crosses to measure things in the photos that nobody thought to measure when the pictures were first taken. The small things were the point the whole time. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.